here is Ron DeSantis talking about the Colombian election results, and you talk about how inextricable the relationship is between the United States and how the U.S. has funded death squads and brutality in Colombia in order to tamp down leftist uprisings for decades and decades, and how that is just so interlinked in Colombian politics that, that's the only way that you can understand it in its fullest context. And here's Ron DeSantis responding to the election results. This guy could very well be the next president of the United States, unfortunately. Here he is referring to the president-elect Petro as a Marxist in a derogatory way, obviously, from DeSantis.
I just want to say, on behalf of the people of Florida, we watched the election results down in Colombia, and we have a lot of great Colombian Americans here in our state who were very concerned about what was going on. And I think the results of that election have been very, very troubling for people that believe in freedom in the Western Hemisphere. To elect a former narco-terrorist and a Marxist to lead Colombia is going to be disastrous. And so we've stood with the people here in Florida that have ties to Colombia. We've had a great relationship with Colombia as a state. We were all hoping that the outcome would be different, but we've got a problem in the Western Hemisphere with Marxism and totalitarianism really spreading. We thought, 25 years ago, the Cold War and all this stuff, and it just keeps rearing its head. So we'll continue to stand with the people of Florida here who are passionate about freedom in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Colombia, but very, very disappointing and very, very troubling.
So who is he speaking to there? I mean, is he really just speaking to Cuban American exiles who are up in arms probably about any kind of wisp of leftism in Latin America? Or is he actually speaking to, is there a constituency of Colombian exiles or Colombian Americans in Florida that kind of have similar politics in that way?
Oh, yeah. No, Miami is a singular cancer on the politics of the hemisphere. And I think that one of the most progressive things we can do is call for the immediate secession of Florida from the United States so we can save our republic from the slide towards a deeply reactionary and terrifying anti-communism. I mean, just to bust a couple myths there. The narco-terrorist thing, I have no idea what he's referring to. So many people have referred to the former guerrilla thing. Okay. Gustavo Petro was part of a urban guerrilla group called the M19 that was left in nature, but not narco-terrorists. They were, fighting against the forces of reaction and dictatorship in Colombia to achieve what they ultimately achieved, which was the 1991 Constitution that tried to enshrine some of the most basic democratic rights for the people of Colombia. And what did they do at that point? They disbanded and became a political party. And that's where Petro's political career really starts. So you're talking about a trajectory of political action that is, shall we say, responsible, if not understandable. I mean, this guy was, mayor of Bogota, where he delivered on some really critical reforms for the people of the city. He's a statesman above all else. So the idea that there's something obscenely radical or narco-terroristic about Petro is not only absurd, but it's almost Rovian in its inversion of the truth, because the true narco-terrorists are the Uribistas. Why? Because they claimed to be clamping down on a drug trade and leading the war on drugs at the instruction of the United States government, when actually what they were doing is overseeing the largest acceleration of cocaine production in the countryside, in huge part because of the right-wing paramilitaries that they were funding, who were absolutely double-dealing the Uribistas and inflicting huge amounts of violence and bloodshed in the countryside. So, there is no way in which that's a classic kind of inversion to say, your strength is your weakness there, when in fact, when we're talking about who expropriated property, when we're talking about who led the terroristic campaigns in Colombia, you're talking about the Colombian right wing, not its social democratic left wing that is now represented by Gustavo Petro.
And those forces are still very much prevalent in Colombia. So the struggle here is not over. I mean, the fact that the attorney general, other elected officials or other officials in Colombia are still in the pocket of some of these moneyed interests and gangs, illegal activity there. The shadows of that still remain. So can you talk a little bit about the uphill battle that, despite this being an incredible victory, that Petro faces and Francia Marquez, their administration, will face in terms of the still remaining infrastructure of U.S. influence and corruption that DeSantis is inverting there?
Emma, we're 7 days out at the time of recording this interview from the anniversary of the coup in Honduras, a very traumatizing moment, and one where we just only recently saw the recovery of democracy by Partido Libre and the president, Xiomara Castro, after so many years of military repression that was ultimately inflamed by southcom, but then endorsed by Hillary Clinton when she was at the Department of State. And obviously, more recently than that, we saw Trump's orchestrated coup in Venezuela, or coup attempt, I should say, with Juan Guaido. And then even more recently than that, in the Joe Biden presidency, we saw this heavily orchestrated and, dare I say, heavily funded, again, kind of grass-topped or astroturfed, rather, coup attempt in Cuba. So, when you talk about the possibility of DeSantis moving towards the presidency, it's obviously a terrifying possibility. And I'm not the kind of person on the left who likes to speak in conspiracy theories and talk about the CIA as a kind of omnipotent force operating in the hemisphere or around the world. But I just think that these are real questions that hang over Colombia. This is a country where political assassination is very real. Petro suffered an assassination attempt in 2018, Marquez in 2019. Death threats were constantly pouring their way from the Black Eagles and other paramilitary groups throughout the campaign. None of that changes now. So the question is who's allowed to live and who is forced to die on the great cross of Uribismo remains to be seen. And that's just speaking about the international kind of military and paramilitary dimension of this. Then there's a whole question about politically. They come into this, not with a huge majority in Congress, with a lot of opposition from the establishment. You're talking about a country where most of the investors signed something about 2 years ago called the Petro Clause that swore at the time that they would leave the country if Petro ever came to power, basically forcing him to promise not to expropriate their property, even though that was never really on the table. So there is just a whole diverse set of challenges and obstacles that stand in the way of even moderate social democratic reform in Colombia, which is why I always try to temper the expectations of people that I speak with on programs like this about what the new pink tide might actually be and look like and achieve. Because whether we're talking about Chile or we're talking about Colombia, or soon we talk about Brazil, you're talking about left or progressive governments coming to power in the context of legislative minorities that make it very difficult for them to do the type of radical, sweeping, and transformative change that they're promising on the campaign trail. And the risk, of course, is that leads to dissolution, dissing on Twitter, whatever it may be. But the point is that we have to really grapple with those obstacles and challenges and basic arithmetic of the politics in order to arrive at a fair assessment of what is to be expected from these governments.
What role broadly has the drug war from the United States played into this dynamic and our relationship with Colombia here? And what does that look like going forward under a Petro administration?
Petro's primary commitment is to what he calls a politics of life, which has two different components. Component number one is a politics of life focused on the drug war. Focused on civil war and the peace process that was abandoned by Ivan Duque after the peace accords were signed in 2016. So that's bringing people to the table. And we already saw that the ELN, I think this has been verified now, that the ELN, one of the major paramilitary groups that's still operating in the countryside, given Petro's win, is now prepared to come back to the table and reinitiate peace talks. So it's a very positive sign if it can be verified. But I know Petro retweeted it, so I think that stands for a degree of verification. So one of the things is the politics of life, taking seriously these massacres and targeted killings that prevailed across the country for so many years. The other part of the politics of life is about the ecological transition. And taking seriously Colombia's desire to have a sustainable and productive economy that isn't through extraction, like through fracking, isn't through extraction, even through the cocaine trade, right? Trying to replace coca plants with, for example, marijuana plants that can be legalized and exported, making a safer, more sustainable, more productive countryside. and it's about phasing out fossil fuels over the next decade so that, Colombia can have a different set of resources. So, I mean, I think that when it comes to the drug trade, there is still so many paramilitary groups operating in the countryside who have tons of guns and weapons. And so questions remain about what it's going to take to bring them to the table, to disband those groups, to find them and target them and understand them and what they're doing. And the irony is, Emma, that the people who really know about this stuff, the people who really know about who's out there, who has the guns, how they're operating, how much cocaine they're producing, is the U.S. government. I mean, the U.S., when we were in Colombia, this was the message we got over and over again. You want to end this drug war, talk to your government, because they're the only ones, even more than the Colombians. The U.S. government is the only ones who knows how much they're producing, where they're selling it, how they're getting into the United States, and how they're getting the guns to maintain their territory out in the countryside.